This is the Burlington Depot that has been restored actually at the National Mississippi River Museum and Aquarium. So a person can go inside of that depot. And this was the Great Western Depot that was located in Dubuque. And of course these are done by Alan Ford, who has done a beautiful job of portraying and painting these pictures. The largest and I think impressive was the Illinois Central Depot. And the Illinois Central at one time was the longest railroad in the world. And the last one I believe was where the Milwaukee was coming into, Milwaukee Road. And of course the Milwaukee had their Milwaukee shops here, and they employed between 1,000 and 2,000 people, and it was the largest employer at the time. So railroads have played a very significant part in our history. And when you're talking with various groups, it's they come up and they'll say, well, did you know that my brother worked for the railroad, or my father worked for the railroad? And so many people in the Dubuque area at one time were employed by the railroads.
How did you get involved in this project?
Well, it goes back almost 6 years, and it's developed over time. One of the things that I felt was that the two things that have made Dubuque what it is today are the river, and the second were railroads. And the National Mississippi River Museum and Aquarium have done a fantastic job in telling the river story, but it seems like the other half of the story has really not been told, this 150-year history of railroads and what it did for Dubuque and what it did for the whole country. And so we felt that the time to do something was now, and be able to tell the story of rail from the Mississippi River basically all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So.
Welcome to Dubuque Transformed, or as I've been learning each hour I'm in Dubuque, more transformed. It seems everything is transforming, so that past tense or whatever that is doesn't seem to be as fitting as Dubuque to continue to be transformed. When I am talking to Ed as we are trying to prepare this, Ed is continually talking about dreams and visions. And so Ed liked us to put in a little Walt Disney phrase, dream, all dreams can come true if we have the courage to pursue them. So why are we here? Why are we here today? I'd like to start out with two quotes. I drew a parallel between the two. First is from John Plum Jr. in 1838. If you don't know who that person is, you'll know it in a minute. John Plum said, "With all due deference for the opinions of those who are disposed to procrastinate, I am well convinced myself there is no time like the present." He said that in 1838. He said that in Dubuque. He said that in Main Street. And he said that in front of Dubuque citizens. And then there's another quote that I've heard numerous times from Ed, and he says there's a story that needs to be told. And like I like to tease, he was at Taylor Studios when he said it multiple times, and I almost want to say he was pounding on the table when he said that. And I said, okay, Ed, it needs to be told. And so that was Ed Shepley, 2012. Parallel? Perhaps. Let's see. So what we're going to do over the next half an hour before the Board of Directors come up and answer questions for a little bit of time after that is we're going to provide information about the opportunity at hand for the Dubuque Railroad Museum and Cultural Center. We're going to talk about efforts made so far, and then we're going to look at the next steps necessary to bring this museum to fruition. So who are these strangers up here? Who are these people from Illinois? I was in New Mexico once doing a job in a museum, and they went to introduce Sam and I, and this is what she said. She said, "I'd like to introduce Sam and Pete, and they are from one of the I states." And I thought, what? One of the I states. So we're a neighboring I state. And I was Iowa, Indiana, Illinois. They don't know the difference out in New Mexico. So that's where we are. We are located in Rantoul, Illinois. So I'm Pete Salmon. I'm an interpretive planner. It's kind of a silly title. What I do is I'm in charge of content development for any museum, any nature center, or any exhibit that we take part in. Our mission, so as a content person, I'm always making sure that the designers in an exhibit are doing it from a content standpoint. This is what we do as a quick thing. We've done over 400 projects, about 5 or 6 in Iowa, and we have 20 years experience. Enough about that. Now about...
Can I mention,
yes, sir.
maybe you're going to object it,
yes.
But I thought it was interesting how you explained being an interpretive planner and how you developed a central theme. Maybe that was...
Oh yeah, that's this slide.
It's coming up. Okay.
You were right there, Randy. You were right there. So I want to give a little bit of background as to what we do, so we're not complete strangers up here. But we're here for the Dubuque Railroad Museum and Cultural Center. As an interpretive planner, which I said before, I'm content-based. And all I'm worried about in a museum is the visitor's experience and its ability, that visitor, to walk away with something. And so we develop what's called a central theme in each exhibit. I don't know how many of you have been to a nice exhibit. It's got great stuff. It's expensive, big dinosaurs, all these different dioramas. You walk out, you scratch your head and say, well, it was nice, but there was no content message. There was no overarching message that the museum was to develop inside you. And that's what I try to avoid. So it's one of my primary functions is to make sure that I establish that overarching theme that is going to inundate the museum. And so when people come home, they leave with something in their hearts and in their minds. Okay? So that's what we call a central theme. I would like everyone that leaves our future museum in Dubuque, I want them to understand that in the creation of Dubuque, the Mississippi River was only half the story, and the railroads the other half. If we could create a museum that substantiates that claim, I think it would be dynamic, I think it would be amazing, and I think that when the children that go there come home and their father's doing the dishes, Johnny, what did you learn today? Well, what I learned was that the Mississippi River is only half of Dubuque's story. That to me was fascinating. So then I started digging around. And as I dug around and looked for other content, I discovered this guy named John Plume. John Plume was the first quote I put up there. John Plume in 1938 hatched, I'm sorry, thank you, 1838 in Dubuque on Main Street, hatched an idea, got a bunch of people from the community, Dubuquers from the community together, and says, I've got this plan. This thing can happen. If we can make a railroad from Lake Michigan down to the Mississippi River, if we can cross the Mississippi River, there's nothing that's going to stop us from taking a train from there to Oregon. So in 1838, the idea was hatched for a transcontinental railroad. So I said, that's impossible. This is my second railroad museum. And I know for a fact that Asa Whitney was the father of the Transcontinental Railroad. So why is Dubuque trying to come in and steal us with this John Plume guy? So I read a little deeper. John Plume, in all his writings, and he sent stuff to Congress and said, this is my plan, this is my plan. He gathered all kinds of people, made multiple speeches. Half the people thought he was a madman. Half the people thought he was a visionary. And the reason that he didn't get the credit was because he never signed his names to all of the newspaper articles that he wrote in all the pamphlets. He wrote it incognito. He wrote it as an Iowan. And so when Asa Whitney started to get all of the credit for this transcontinental railroad, John Plume never said a word. He kept quiet. Now I need to go deeper in there. But the layers of meaning come from that central theme, that theme of it's only half the story. What if we want to make it larger and talk about the father of the transcontinental railroad being developed in Dubuque? That is what really made me happy. That was 1:30 2 nights ago, and then I was excited. I wanted at 2 o'clock to give you a presentation, but I didn't have your numbers. So, as a content guy, I am on board. Now, I understand I'm only a content guy, but boy, oh boy, this I saw as an opportunity. First time I met Ed, I said, oh, okay, well, that sounds interesting. Last time I meet Ed, I'm like, hey, I'm on board. Let me do what I can to help. And this is the quote that really actually got me excited. To John Plume and to Dubuque is due the honor and credit of originating and persistently advocating the Great Pacific Railroad policy years before the subject was taken up by Whitney or anyone else.
So without further ado, I want to introduce you to the Board of Directors for the Dubuque Railroad Museum and Cultural Center. We have Ed Shepley, who I assume most of you know, but if you'd say hi or stand up, Ed. Ed was president of the W.S. Shepley Company from 1968 to 87. He's an ordained minister and has shepherded many churches. He's a railroad and community activist and is a leader in the downtown, or was a leader in the downtown renewal planning. He's largely responsible for transforming the Dubuque building, which is the former Roshed building, into which is now the home to IBM. We also have David Solberg. David, can you rise? Say hello. David's the vice president and secretary of the Railroad Museum. He is also ordained and well educated. He served as pastor for multiple churches and has particular strengths in leadership and strategic planning, as well as mission support and fundraising. Here in Dubuque, he served as Director of Development at the Wartburg Theological Seminary and as Interim President for Mission Support at Cross Family Services in Dubuque as well. Tom Riley's here with us. Tom is also Vice President and Treasurer for the museum. Tom has over 50 years experience in financial management. He served as Vice President and Senior Vice President for a number of companies that include the American Trust and Savings Bank and East Dubuque Savings Bank. He too is a community activist. He's moved the clock tower, or town clock I should say. He's a member of Dubuque JCs, Rotary, SCORE, and Dubuque Ride the Rail. Michael Jansen, I don't see him here with us this morning, but Michael Jansen is also a board member. He brings over 25 years of experience with engineering, architecture, and surveying to the table. He himself is a professional and structural engineer, and he's helping to lead and implement the nonprofit efforts and objectives of the museum. All of them will be available, well, 3 of the 4 will be available for question and answer after our presentation here. And so, what Ed and the board have revealed over the last few years since they've been working at this together is really an exciting opportunity. It's an opportunity to tell the missing piece of history, which is the role that the railroad played in the development of Dubuque, which Pete alluded to earlier. Right now, the National Mississippi River Museum does a wonderful job of connecting the Mississippi to the development and success of Dubuque, but the whole railroad story is completely missing and lacking from what we offer to the public. This is an opportunity to introduce new generations to the history of this town of Dubuque. The history, and the history of Dubuque and the impact of railroads on this community has never been told or made available to the public or been made accessible. It's an opportunity to create a place that inspires visitors by exhibiting how ordinary citizens made a difference. The city of Dubuque right now is a pretty happening place. So far, the port's been wildly successful economically, and the newspaper in town continues to put out article after article about the success of Dubuque. They've named the city America's Model City, and most recently there was an article that came out that talked about Dubuque having just gone through a Renaissance period. So this is a hip town, and what better place to develop a museum than Dubuque to talk about the railroad. And so continue on the story of John Plume and a little bit more background. I'll give it back over to Pete.
So as I said, he was a gentleman that started to spark this idea, to talk about this idea. Why stop just bridging the Mississippi? Let's go all the way to the, let's join the two oceans. And his talk going around, and he did it for many, many, many years, at least 10 years he was giving these presentations. And this, he planted a seed that started to pick up and culminate in a railroad fever of the 1850s. So I'm just going to go through a couple of interesting dates to show you how distinctly connected Dubuque is with the railroad. During the 1850s, construction of the Illinois between Dubuque and Sioux City led to hordes of settlers moving to eastern Iowa. The Illinois Central changed its name to the Dubuque and Pacific and became incorporated. It opened 29 miles of track from Dubuque to Dyersville. In 1860, 78 more miles completed between Dubuque and Jessup. The company reorganized as the Dubuque and Sioux City Railroad. In 1866, the rail reaches Iowa Falls and Dubuque. It becomes a hotbed for railroads with multiple companies with goals to build in all directions. Dunleith and Dubuque Bridge, also known as the Railroad Bridge, is built by the Keystone Bridge Company and Andrew Carnegie, eventually allowing for regular train service from Chicago through Dubuque to Sioux City. And this is in the Linwood Cemetery, is John Plume's gravestone. So how could this possibly be treated, when we start to think about what would it look like and some of the things. That's way down the road. But there's some interesting things that we can do already as I'm trying to think and get excited about how things could happen. The story of the railroad allows us a platform to tell and teach the history of Dubuque. Every good museum exhibit has a through line. It has something that you can look for and make sense. Okay? It's not a hodgepodge of things. And so this museum will use the railroad to be that through line, talk about different eras in Dubuque history. And in my own mind, this is only in my own mind, Ed might hate the idea, but in my own mind when I read that line, I immediately thought of how interesting it would be for a group of school children to pile into, I shouldn't use the word pile in, that sounds dangerous, walk in nicely into a rail car, all of a sudden move a little bit, exit out another door, and now they're in a different time and a different place in Iowa. That's the way I see a through line. We can use that train to access all the different historical aspects of Dubuque. Those different eras would be treated separately. We used the train to get there, but now we're going to talk about different eras of Dubuque. But we're not only going to talk about the stories of the rails, but the rails and the industries and the institutions are all combined. There's a combination there. Each one led to the advancement of the other. Therefore, it's a cultural museum. This is not a museum for I actually do know a guy that spends a lot of time in his basement with his toy trains. This is not a museum just for that person. This is a museum that's going to open up the opportunity and the interests for a lot of people in Dubuque using the train as the main vehicle. And there's where we get the cultural center. Just look at a couple lines back. The train allowed immigrants to come to eastern Iowa. Well, that's a story that needs to be told. That's a cultural story that needs to be told. And so we're not going to stop at this is a train, this is a narrow gauge train, this is the type of engine it had. It's going to be expansive.
So why does this make sense? Well, first, it's good timing, but I'll get to that in a moment. It makes sense because the addition of a railroad museum to what the port currently offers brings some distinctive variety to the area. Now the port offers a lot of river-specific entities. There's the River Center, the River Museum, the River Walk, amongst other things. And so bringing something that offers a discussion of railroad and culture to that area would really add variety and interest. In hopes then that it would also strengthen the area as a destination point for locals and tourists. The plot of land that the board has identified advantageously is juxtaposed right next to railroad tracks, so that's pretty dang cool. And there's also an available building around that plot of land that is a green building, is sustainable, and is beautiful, and we'll show you that in just a moment. Like I said, it's relevant timing. Right now, Dubuque is working on railroad service to and from Chicago. The city just applied for a grant to construct a passenger rail platform at the port. So how cool would it be to parallel that success with the success of this museum and development? And to give you some context, well, I'll show you some aerial photos. We have the port here. And the portion of land that they've identified as the best piece of property to do this at is this right here. And this is the specific building that they've located. The green highlight is the railroad. So the rail runs right next to it. To give you an overview of the timeline of progress made so far, in short, in 2006, the need for this museum is realized. 2008, Ed creates the board of directors. In 2009, there were multiple newspaper articles chronicled about the passion and vision for bringing this museum to fruition. 2010, Dubuque Railroad Museum is formed as Iowa nonprofit. Just this year, they opened their doors to a development office right on Main Street, and they also filed for federal nonprofit status this year. A couple of other efforts include a number of meetings with other museum directors and boards and movers and shakers in the community to help move this progress along. I know Ed has done extensive study on best practices and museum best practices. And he's also identified a number of really cool historic artifacts that would help get this museum jump-started off the ground. And so next steps to continue moving this project along, first would be a feasibility study. We'd also need planning and development for the museum. And purchase of one of those cool, unique artifacts, which is somewhat of an urgent matter. That purchase would be a 1901 presidential rail car. And the reason this is somewhat urgent and unique is that it's one of the only 1901 presidential rail cars in existence. It's already museum quality. It's been well treated, preserved, and restored. And they have an inside deal with a really great price on it. So the deal won't last forever. So this particular rail car was built by the Pullman Company when Robert Todd Lincoln was the head of that company, who is President Abraham Lincoln's son. And then another cool story associated with this particular car is Teddy Roosevelt rode on this car and addressed from the platform to different suburbs of Chicago. So there may be some regional pull if we could secure this car to the museum's collection. So how can you help? Monetary gifts would help fund things like a feasibility study. It's early in the game, but those are types of things that we need to fundraise for. Exposure is extremely appreciated. Any word of mouth you could help spread about this museum, or take loads of brochures in the back, hand them out to your colleagues, friends, anybody that you think might be interested. As well as donation of relevant artifacts for collections. So if you know somebody or have a family member that might be holding on to something cool that could eventually be showcased in a museum, this is the place to donate those items to or loan them to. So we're asking for your help and support to work and accomplish this major development for this museum in the city of Dubuque. And much like John Plume planted a seed for his idea, that's kind of what we're trying to do here today, plant the seed for this museum and hope that you guys can all help us make it happen. So without further ado, I'd like to invite the board up here, and they'll continue the discussion about efforts made.
Railroads played such a key part in the development of Dubuque. And we think after 150 years' time that it's time to tell that story now. Now, as Pete and Samantha were saying, that it's more than just rail cars and a lot of heavy equipment outside. In other words, perhaps maybe we'll only have one rail car, and there's a brochure on that in the back that is available to us, so help yourself to those. But we want to tell the story of what rail did for the city of Dubuque, how it influenced the industries that came. Most of us realize that, like with Dubuque Packing Company, they shipped their goods all over the whole country and the world, and they used rail to do it. They had the fleur-de-lis on the side of their rail cars. And that product was in almost every major market throughout the country. When you talk about Farley and Letcher and Carr Adams and Collier, those companies had to move their product from Dubuque by rail to all parts of the whole country. What I learned when I visited the museum in Potosi, Wisconsin, where they had the Potosi Brewery, was that at one time they only could ship maybe 6 miles their product out because it would spoil. And so in essence, it wasn't until rail came along that they could have regional and national distribution. And so rail has played this tremendous impact on the entire United States. The other side of it is that during the Second World War, I read the fact that 95 to 97% of all of the service people were transported by rail. And 90% of the products that were manufactured, tanks and equipment, were shipped by rail. And so I guess I want to maybe close with this thought, that it's not just the equipment, it's not just rail, but it is the people that have been employed in these industries in Dubuque. We want to tell that story. We want to tell the story about the educational institutions. We want to tell the story about the churches and non-profit organizations that are part of Dubuque. In other words, there's so many various facets of this, and we want to make it a fun place for people wanting to come and visit. And the other factor is that it's not just the education of our young people, but in reading about museums today, that with our culture being aging to 50 years and above, that these people want to take and visit things like museums, to occupy their time, to have their grandchildren come with them and visit the history. And so museums are a big factor that way. So there's a lot of aspects to this. We're looking at probably a $6 to a $10 million project. We think that hopefully a building would be in the $3.5 million range, $3 to $3.5 million, and that the exhibits would probably be $3 million on top of that. So, but we think it's also not only wonderful for Dubuque, it's wonderful for tourism, it's wonderful, as Rick Dickinson said, when companies move to an area, they're concerned that the people want to live there. And this would also enhance that aspect. So again, thank you all for coming, and there's brochures and different pieces you're welcome to pick up as you leave. Sorry it's taken so long.
Thank you. It was 50 years ago last fall that I arrived in Dubuque to enroll at Wartburg Seminary. Upon our arrival, they took us on a tour. We went to the shot tower and up to the park and overlooked the dam. And that was about it at that particular time, but it introduced me to Dubuque. The shot tower, of course, was significant in an early era of Dubuque's history when this was a significant mining area. And then I also was fortunate enough to get a job, which happened to be for River Trails Transit Line at that time, which is now, if you see the Tri-State Tour buses down on the side, it says owned and operated by River Trails Transit Line. One of the jobs that we often got to do, students had some flexibility, especially during the night, was to meet all the passenger trains in East Dubuque from the historic, or from the Burlington Depot. There were trains during the day, but there was also one 10:40 at night, and another one 1:20 in the morning, and another one at 3:45. And we met all those trains and transported people back and forth. Well, that introduced me to a little bit of railroad history. I learned at that time that this was a center for the Milwaukee Road. There was a roundhouse here. One time, a couple thousand employees. If there was an accident on the Milwaukee Road, it came back to Dubuque to be repaired. But what has really been attractive to me has been the vitality of Dubuque throughout its history. Not only is it a great place to live now, but it's gone through many transitions. From mining, it was a lumbering center. Then came some early manufacturers such as A.Y. McDonald. John Deere is here as a manufacturer. The toy manufacturing industry actually started in Dubuque. The city now owns the building, I guess, up on Wilbrick Street or whatever it is, that was the first place for model toys to be built. And now it's been a transition again more recently. We moved here in '84, and a lot of people wondered, why are you going to Dubuque when the situation was not nearly the way it is today. And it's made another transition into tourism, marketing that, and also somewhat of a financial center with a lot of financial services that not all of us know about. That vitality that is so often referred to and referenced. This is a good place to live. It's a safe place for children, and that's central. Every child, every promise, every child, or whatever it is. And also a community foundation that serves a significant part of what makes this place a dynamic place to live, along with city government and the Development Corporation that continues to enhance Dubuque, and that's not well known by everybody and could be better relayed.
Things all been said, but I grew up on the 2nd of Bluff Street, and I used to play down on all these places down here. I played them all, and my dad knew every whistle of every train that came to Dubuque, and that's about it.
We also, of course, are Dave Solberg is the chairperson of our Amtrak committee to have the Chicago Dubuque line restored. And we think that's going to be not only a wonderful draw for people from Chicago, but the Railroad Museum would also be something that they would really be interested in, and especially having this rail car that was from the Elgin area. To see something like that, I think, would be a nice draw for the museum. So again, we thank everybody.
In tourism and that, I think the things that I read is that people like to go where there are multiple entities and can stay for longer times and make that a visit. I think one of the things that I've even read about is somebody's been somewhere for a convention and then came back later with their family and stayed 2 or 3 days. And those communities are also represented then by a series of places for people to do things. Dubuque has lots of things. There's the water park, there's the museum, there's the Arboretum, there's Lower Main Street and things like that. There's the Dubuque Art Museum, there's our community theaters. This would just be another item in this whole string of activities that it just in the area of tourism alone could be a significant contributor. Keith?
I remember in 2004 I was lucky enough to be brought on to run the Grand Excursion. And I don't know if many of you participated in that, but not only did we have the paddle wheelers, but the steam engine. And at the time when we were making plans for that, I had a rail gentleman that worked here. He said, "You better have a lot of security down there when that steam engine comes into town." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He goes, "These people are fanatical." He said, "They will literally crawl all over that train." He was not, and we had over 8,000 people down along that, right outside the old depot that day. And before that train even stopped, there were people almost trying to crawl underneath it to get a look at it. So not only do you have that clientele, but like you had mentioned, you know, with all the other visitors that are coming to Dubuque, they're always looking for other things to do, not only for Dubuque, but in the tri-state area, and the convention delegates. So, you know, that'd be a unique off-site opportunity for convention delegates to go to. Now we utilize the National Mississippi River Museum quite a bit for that, the riverboats and such. So yeah, it's tremendous. Congratulations on spearheading this effort, and I know you guys are tenacious with this, with your efforts with the Amtrak and with this, and I take my hat off to all of your committee. You've been tremendous. So.
Can't thank you enough for taking the time out of your busy schedules and being here. And don't hesitate if there's any thoughts that you have and you want to email. I think that I've got one card on the table, and you can email me any thoughts you might have. We've got our office now. We don't have it fully staffed. We may have at some point a part-time secretary, and I'm in and out of it, but it's in Suite 322 at 300 Main, so we're close by. And one of the things we hope to do is maybe we'll be having some programs at like Rotary and Lions and other to let more people know what we are trying to accomplish and asking for their help and support.